I walked into the office that morning knowing something was off, but I didn't yet know just how badly. The smell of stale coffee mixed with over-sanitized air hit me like a warning sign. My new job as the Chief Compliance Officer at Whitmore Industries had been pitched as a fresh start, clean slate position, but the second I stepped into the lobby, I realized corporate chaos had a smell, and this was it. The reception area was nearly empty, except for a young intern scuttling nervously behind the desk, eyes glued to a screen that might as well have been a nuclear launch panel for all the tension radiating from it. I clear my throat and flash my ID. The intern jumped, nearly spilling a cup of pens. "Emily Holt," I said, calm but firm. "I'm here for my first day as CCO." He nodded so quickly it looked like a bobblehead in motion. Right. HR. They said yes. Go on up." The elevator ride was quiet, but my mind was racing. I had read the job description, of course. I had even skimmed the compliance handbook Whitmore's HR had sent me. But as I glanced at the reflective steel walls, I remembered the contract, that one document that had everyone laughing when I insisted on reading it clause by clause before signing. Everyone had waved it off. "It's just standard corporate language," they had said. Standard, maybe, but corporate language had teeth, and I intended to bite. I stepped off on the 12th floor and immediately noticed the tension in the air. Employees shuffled like roaches avoiding the light. Whispered greetings died mid-sentence when I passed. And there it was, like a beacon of chaos, the CEO's right-hand man, Dan Whitmore Jr., standing with his usual overconfidence, shoulders puffed up as though he had single-handedly built the empire. He looked at me and smiled in that way executives do when they know something you don't. I returned the smile, tight-lipped. I had already read his emails, his memos, his LinkedIn posts. Every word of arrogance carefully catalogued. "Emily," he said, extending a hand that screamed, "Benevolent tyrant. Welcome to the team. Excited to see what you bring." I shook it. "Thank you," I said. "I intend to make a difference." He chuckled softly. "I'm sure you do." And with that, he turned on his heel, leaving me with a faint smell of expensive cologne and an unmistakable warning. He didn't take me seriously. I made my way to the office HR had set up. The corner suite, modest but clean, gave me a perfect view of the floor. Employees came and went like anxious ghosts, every interaction a tiny performance of politeness. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. My first task, verify the compliance logs. That's when I saw it. The first red flag. A memo, buried 3 layers deep in the system, flagged a series of contract renewals. Normally, these would be routine. But the files were missing critical approvals, and someone had altered dates to make it appear as though everything had been signed off. My pulse quickened. Someone had been playing fast and loose with the legal foundations of the company. I pulled up the original contract I had insisted on reading thoroughly. Every word mattered, every clause a potential weapon or a trap. And there it was, hidden in plain sight. Clause 42B, subsection 7. Most people would scroll past it. Most people had. But I hadn't. It wasn't just a footnote. It was a guarantee. A clause that gave me, as the appointed Chief Compliance Officer, the right to halt operations if the company failed to meet explicit contractual obligations. Failed to read? Failed to comply? That clause activated automatically, no signatures required. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. If I chose, I could bring this entire floor, maybe the whole company, to its knees. Not for revenge. Not yet. But the power, it was intoxicating. Minutes later, my first email arrived. Dan Whitmore Jr. copy-pasted a friendly reminder about budget projections. I read it once, twice, noting the inaccuracies, the overstatements, the tiny embellishments meant to impress investors but cover up gaps in internal reporting. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could reply, I could ignore, I could wait. But patience, always patience, was the real weapon. As the day progressed, I noticed the same patterns everywhere, missing approvals, overlooked audits, manipulated spreadsheets. People were afraid. Fear had become a method of management here. And I was standing in the middle of it all, quietly, calculating, noting, letting every careless move, every hidden act, fall under my observation. By noon, I had my first meeting with the senior management team. They were expecting a routine introduction, a warm smile, maybe a pep talk. Instead, I walked in with my notes, quietly documenting everything: who avoided eye contact, who whispered, who fidgeted with their phones. And then Dan Jr. made his mistake. "You'll find I've handled most of the compliance groundwork," he said smugly. "I trust you'll just review what's already in place." I smiled, keeping it slow, deliberate. "Of course," I said. And in that smile was a warning he couldn't read. Clause 42b, subsection 7. The entire foundation of their little empire was about to meet scrutiny. And the funny thing? They didn't even know it existed. They had never read my contract. The meeting dragged on. I nodded at their presentations, took notes, asked questions that seemed innocuous, but were carefully designed to probe for inconsistencies. Every answer revealed more cracks. Every smile I offered was a calm mask hiding the storm that was quietly gathering. By 3 p.m., I had a preliminary file ready. A small folder of discrepancies, minor but significant enough that, if escalated, would trigger serious consequences. I leaned back, watching the office buzz around me, everyone still blissfully unaware of the ticking time bomb I held in my hands. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a corporate oversight. This was negligence on a scale that could end careers, and potentially the company itself. I closed my laptop, stretched, and looked out the window at the city beyond. The sun glinted off the glass towers, reflecting a world that moved at 1,000,000 miles an hour, oblivious to the tiny wars happening inside offices like this one. Tomorrow, I thought, I'd begin quietly. A meeting here, a memo there. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just clarity. And clarity, when wielded properly, was far more destructive than any shout, any scandal, any reckless decision. I didn't know if I would need to activate Clause 42b. I didn't know how far it would go. But I knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated me. And when they realized their mistake, it would be too late. Because some mistakes, once made, aren't just overlooked, they are fatal. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting sharp stripes across my desk. The city outside was waking up, but inside Whitmore Industries, the real alarm hadn't even begun. I sipped my coffee slowly, feeling the quiet thrill of being the only one who knew what was coming. Everyone else, executives, managers, even Dan Jr., still thought today would be just another ordinary Tuesday. But today I was going to prove them wrong. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder I had quietly prepared the day before. Minor inconsistencies, skipped approvals, altered figures, missing signatures. Each one seemed small in isolation, but when strung together, they formed a chain of negligence so serious it practically screamed legal exposure. The first step, observe without revealing. I needed to see who truly ran this place behind the polished meetings and artificial smiles. I watched Dan Jr. in his office across the hall. He barked orders over the phone, oblivious to the fact that every word, every decision, would be scrutinized. Every small lie or exaggeration was a thread waiting to be pulled. I had my plan. Slowly, methodically, I began sending subtle, innocent-looking emails, requests for clarifications, confirmations of approvals, polite inquiries about missing signatures. Nothing alarming, just questions. Within the hour, the cracks began to show. A senior manager, usually confident and cocky, stumbled over her response. Her email was hurried, defensive. Another tried to cover up an error by forwarding old, outdated documents. By lunch, the nervous energy on the floor was palpable. People were checking and rechecking, whispering in corners, and glancing at me with subtle unease. I didn't move a muscle. I just watched. At 1 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from HR. Dan Jr. wants to see you immediately. He's concerned about your queries. Concern. I smiled inwardly. The first ripple in the pond had formed. I walked to his office, not hurried, but with the calm of someone in complete control. The door opened before I could knock. Dan Jr. was already pacing, Hands clenched, the polished confidence from yesterday replaced by tight-jawed irritation. "Emily," he said, forcing a smile. "I see you've been very thorough with these reports." "Of course," I replied evenly. "It's my job to ensure compliance. We can't afford mistakes." He leaned back, eyes darting over my desk, then to the laptop in my hands. "I understand," he said, voice carefully controlled. "But some of these are trivial issues. Don't you think?" I met his gaze. Trivial? Perhaps on their own. But together? They indicate systemic issues. For a moment, he looked as though he might argue. Then he stopped, blinked, and the slightest flicker of doubt passed across his face. That's when I knew. The seed had been planted. Returning to my desk, I began drafting a formal report. Not an email, not a memo, but a detailed compliance assessment. Every discrepancy noted, every missing approval documented, and every error tied to its potential legal and financial risk. As I typed, I realized something almost poetic. The clause I had fought to read, Clause 42B, subsection 7, wasn't just a tool. It was a mirror. Every failure, every skipped signature, every careless executive decision reflected back the truth. They had ignored contracts, procedures, and ethics for too long. By mid-afternoon, whispers had spread. Employees were glancing at one another, murmuring questions they couldn't quite voice. Dan Jr. noticed, of course, and his irritation grew. I could see it in the way he tapped his pen, in the way he muttered under his breath during meetings, in the way he avoided my eye contact in the hallway. That evening, as the office emptied, I sent the final report to the CEO, Dan Sr., with a calm subject line, "Compliance assessment and urgent action required." I leaned back in my chair and watched the city lights flicker outside. This was the first wave, gentle but deliberate. I wasn't making a scene. I wasn't taking dramatic action yet. I was letting the system expose itself. The mistakes, the oversights, the arrogance, they would speak louder than I ever could. And tomorrow? Tomorrow would be even more revealing. I had already identified the critical transactions that violated regulatory approvals. One by one, I would escalate them, not with fanfare, but with undeniable authority. Clause 42B wasn't just a safety net, it was a guillotine hidden in plain sight. By the time the executives realized what was happening, it would be too late. They thought they had built a company capable of surviving any storm. They didn't realize the storm had been inside all along. And I was the quiet wind that would bring it crashing down. The morning arrived like a slow drumbeat, every second punctuated by the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant click of heels on polished floors. Whitmore Industries had no idea that its carefully curated illusion of control was about to collapse. And I was the calm observer, a predator in a suit, waiting for the first ripple to become a wave. Emails had already begun to circulate before the elevators even opened. Managers, supervisors, and team leads were reacting instinctively, but without clarity. Some were frantic, others cautious. A few tried to ignore it entirely. Their reactions were telling. Those who understood the gravity of Clause 42B were already pale with dread. Those who didn't, they were about to learn the hard way. I spent the first hour reviewing every response from yesterday's compliance report. Patterns began to emerge, predictable yet damning. Missed deadlines, approvals ignored, contracts altered without authorization. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic, embedded into the DNA of the company's operations. And every single executive, from Dan Jr. to the CFO, had participated knowingly or unknowingly in the negligence. By 10 a.m., Dan Jr. had called an emergency meeting. Naturally, he assumed I was the problem. I arrived calmly, holding nothing but a notepad, giving off the illusion of passive neutrality. The conference room was filled with tension. It crackled in the air like static before a storm. Every eye was on me. "Emily," Dan Jr. started, his voice tight, "we need to discuss these inconsistencies in your report. Some of this doesn't make sense." I didn't flinch. "It's simple," I said, voice steady. "These are facts. Each discrepancy has supporting documentation. Each one represents a procedural failure. and collectively, they indicate a pattern of negligence. A murmur ran through the room. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. Legal counsel, usually composed, was scribbling notes furiously. The executives who had ignored approvals were suddenly very aware of their own culpability. Dan Jr. tried to regain control. Some of this is minor. Clerical errors. Small oversights. I met his gaze directly. Minor errors only stay minor if they're addressed. Ignored, they compound. And under Clause 42b, subsection 7, failure to follow contractual and procedural obligations is not minor. It is grounds for immediate executive review and potential removal. The words landed like a hammer. You could feel the air in the room shift, heavier now, charged with fear. It didn't take long for the dominoes to start falling. One by one, department heads were summoned to verify their own compliance. Emails and documents that had been ignored for months now became evidentiary gold. A few executives tried to argue, claiming misunderstandings or miscommunications. Others stayed silent, aware that their silence was already incriminating. By lunchtime, HR had begun a parallel investigation. Meredith had her team cross-reference approvals, emails, and project logs. Every conversation I had had quietly documented became a thread in the growing tapestry of accountability. Employees began coming forward, subtle at first, whispers in corners, nervous messages sent privately. Their evidence confirmed the patterns I had already predicted. Then came the first confrontation. Dan Sr., the CEO, invited me into his office. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "Emily," he said slowly, "I've read the report. It's comprehensive. The implications are serious. Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" I nodded. "I'm not here to punish, only to ensure compliance. The facts speak for themselves." He exhaled deeply. "Very well. Proceed." And so I did. I began escalating each violation according to protocol, careful to leave nothing ambiguous. One by one, emails were sent, memos drafted, HR notified, and legal advised. Each action was procedural, above reproach, leaving no room for subjective interpretation. By 3 p.m., the floor was a nervous mess. Executives who had spent years projecting confidence now moved cautiously, eyes flicking to me with barely concealed fear. Dan Jr. avoided me entirely, whispering to assistants rather than confront me directly. Their hubris had blinded them. Now, the consequences were inevitable. The first official consequence landed in the afternoon. A senior executive, previously untouchable, was called into HR. The documentation was presented calmly, methodically, without judgment, without theatrics. They read Clause 42b, subsection 7. Their face turned pale. They realized too late that the contract they had ignored wasn't just legal boilerplate, it was a sword hanging silently above them, and I had just nudged it into motion. Back at my desk, I watched it all unfold. The whispers, the nervous glances, the frantic typing, every reaction was a confirmation that the system was working. I didn't need to speak loudly. I didn't need to show force. I had activated the machinery, and it had momentum of its own. By evening, the message had reached every department. The company, once complacent and arrogant, was now aware that oversight had consequences. The executives who had once laughed at protocols now double-checked every step. The nervous tension wasn't fear for me. It was fear of their own choices, their own negligence, and the contract they failed to respect. And I remained calm, composed, sipping coffee, a silent conductor of the chaos that was only just beginning to crescendo. Because tomorrow, Clause 42b would show its full teeth, and the dominoes that had begun to fall today would start toppling the real power players. The morning air was colder than usual, almost surgical in its precision, as if the building itself had braced for the reckoning. Whitmore Industries executives moved through the halls with the quiet tension of people knowing the ground could vanish beneath them at any second. Every keycard swipe, every muted phone buzz, every hurried glance at an inbox was a reminder that the rules they had ignored were now enforcing themselves with absolute precision. By 8:30 a.m., the first formal terminations had been issued. Legal had done its part flawlessly. HR had compiled every document, every memo, every email thread, and every manipulated calendar entry. Nothing was speculative. Nothing could be disputed. Clause 42b, subsection 7, was a sword swinging with cold inevitability. Dan Jr., pale and jittery, was called into the first formal review session. The CFO followed closely behind, and by 9 o'clock, both were sitting across from Meredith and Vincent in the main conference room. I watched discreetly from my office, sipping coffee as if nothing were happening. But every click of the mouse, every shuffle of paper, was music. The executives were about to learn what happens when arrogance meets accountability. Dan Jr. tried to argue, voice wavering. This is a misunderstanding. Some of these weren't intentional. Vincent didn't blink. Intent doesn't matter. Compliance does. Clause 42b doesn't entertain excuses. Only documented actions and omissions are relevant. And your file, over 200 logged violations, speaks for itself. The smirk that had once defined Dan Jr. as hubris vanished. The CFO looked around, eyes darting for an escape that didn't exist. They were trapped, fully exposed. By 10 a.m., internal systems were locking them out. Emails bounced automatically. Access to project management software revoked. Even the simplest administrative privileges were removed. The executives had spent years believing their positions were invincible. Now, the same contracts they ignored were ensuring they were untouchable from the company itself. It didn't stop there. Clients, alerted indirectly through operational managers, began noticing inconsistencies. Orders had been delayed, approvals ignored, and projects left hanging. I had quietly flagged these issues in advance, so the clients had already been prepped for corrective action. When executives tried to intervene, their access denied them. Every attempt to control the narrative failed. Clause 42b had created a perfect storm, one they couldn't steer, and one they couldn't survive. By noon, whispers had transformed into panic. Department heads who had once dismissed protocols were now frantic, scrambling to correct minor oversights that were no longer minor. Each action only tightened the net. Employees watched in stunned silence. The culture that had tolerated neglect and arrogance for years now trembled under the weight of accountability. And then came the final domino. The board of directors was briefed. Every violation documented, every executive file cross-referenced, and every contractual clause invoked. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. The board didn't have to argue. They didn't have to deliberate. Clause 42b did all the talking. By 2 p.m., Dan Jr., the CFO, and 3 other senior executives were escorted out. Not with fanfare, not with dramatic confrontation, just procedural execution. The employees who had suffered under their negligence watched silently, some relieved, some shocked, all aware that justice had arrived without theatrics. I remained at my desk, calm, observing, not celebrating. Justice, in this instance, wasn't about ego, it was about clarity, about demonstrating that systems and contracts exist for a reason. It wasn't personal. It was procedural perfection in action. The remaining leadership began to rebuild under new guidance, carefully selected and vetted. I personally oversaw the onboarding of new managers, instilling the lessons learned. Accountability is not optional, and contracts are not suggestions. The office slowly exhaled, learning to function again without fear or chaos. By late afternoon, the finality had settled. Emails, Slack channels, and operational access reflected the new reality. The building's hum was no longer oppressive. It was quiet, steady, productive. Employees moved with confidence, not caution. Respect wasn't enforced through fear anymore. It existed because the system now demanded it, and everyone could see that violations had consequences. I walked through the office one last time, holding my coffee, savoring the calm that followed years of tolerated dysfunction. I paused at the very spot where the first domino had fallen, the place where arrogance and neglect had once thrived. Now, nothing remained. The kingdom of inefficiency had collapsed without drama, without shouting, without revenge. just the precise execution of the rules everyone had ignored. Whitmore Industries would survive, but not without change. Lessons had been burned into its foundation. And I had simply held the stage, allowed the system to work, and let them all deliver their own reckoning.
No dramatics. No fury.
Just clarity, procedure, and inevitability. By 5 p.m., the office was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. Employees packed up for the day, a sense of calm and restored order in their steps. I returned to my office, poured one last cup of coffee, and allowed myself a small, satisfied exhale. Contracts are words on paper, but when ignored, they become weapons. And when respected, they become shields. Whitmore Industries had learned this the hard way, but the lesson was eternal. I took a final sip, leaned back in my chair, and smiled softly. They didn't read my contract. And that mistake? That mistake had ended their company. Thanks for joining the fun, you office survivors. Subscribe for more switch-flicking drama.